The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls when Sheriff Tom Bradley pulled up to the small courthouse. The town of barely 3,000 souls rarely saw much excitement beyond cattle disputes and the occasional bar fight on Saturday nights. But today was different. Today, the entire community had divided itself into two camps over a 17-year-old girl named Emma Chun. Emma sat on the courthouse steps, her guide dog Rex lying quietly beside her. Her fingers traced patterns in the air as she waited, a nervous habit she'd developed since losing her sight in a car accident 3 years ago. The accident that had also claimed her adoptive parents, leaving her in the care of her grandmother in this small Wyoming town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Or at least they thought they did. The charges against Emma were serious. Vandalism of private property, specifically the destruction of Mayor Henderson's prized rose garden that had won the state competition for 5 consecutive years. The damage was extensive. Every bush had been systematically destroyed, roots pulled up, the greenhouse windows smashed. The estimated cost exceeded $5,000, enough to make it a felony in Wyoming. What made the accusation particularly cruel was the method allegedly used. Someone had deliberately poured bleach over the roots and used a shovel to destroy what had taken Henderson decades to cultivate. The precision of the destruction suggested intimate knowledge of gardening, and Emma had been known to help her grandmother in her own small garden behind their modest rental house on Elm Street. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Emma's fingerprints were found on a shovel discovered near the scene. A neighbor claimed to have seen her walking toward Henderson's property around midnight 3 days ago. Most damning of all, Emma and Mayor Henderson had engaged in a heated public argument just a week before the incident. That argument had started when Henderson tried to have Emma's grandmother evicted from their rental property. The house belonged to Henderson's real estate portfolio, and he wanted to convert it into a vacation rental for the tourists who occasionally passed through during hunting season. Emma had confronted him outside the post office, accusing him of targeting elderly residents who couldn't fight back. "You can't just throw people out because you want more money," Emma had said, her voice carrying across the street where half the town witnessed the exchange. "My grandmother has lived there for 15 years. She has rights." Henderson's response had been swift and cutting. "Rights don't pay rent, young lady, and neither does your grandmother's Social Security check when it comes up short every month. Maybe you should focus on helping her instead of wandering around town at all hours pretending you can see what you're doing." The cruel reference to her blindness had stung Emma into silence, but the damage was done. In a town like Cedar Falls, such a public confrontation was remembered, discussed, and embellished with each retelling. Now, as Emma waited for her court appearance, she could feel the weight of the community's judgment. Some townspeople crossed the street to avoid walking past her. Others stared openly, whispering to their companions. She had gone from being the brave girl who'd overcome tragedy to being the ungrateful delinquent who destroyed the town's pride and joy. But not everyone had abandoned her. Jack Morrison pulled his dusty pickup truck into the courthouse parking lot, the engine ticking as it cooled in the morning heat. At 62, Jack had run the Double M Ranch for more than 40 years, building it from a struggling operation inherited from his father into one of the most successful cattle ranches in 3 counties. His weathered hands and sun-lined face told the story of decades spent working the land, but his eyes remained sharp and kind. Jack had known Emma since she'd arrived in Cedar Falls after the accident. He'd watched her struggle to adapt to her new reality, learning to navigate the town's uneven sidewalks with her cane, then later with Rex. He'd seen her help elderly neighbors with their shopping, volunteer to read to children at the library despite having to use Braille herself, and work tirelessly to help her grandmother make ends meet. The Jack Morrison who climbed out of his truck that morning was a man who had built his reputation on fairness and integrity. He'd served on the town council for 12 years, mediated countless disputes between neighbors, and had never been known to back down when he believed something was right. He also happened to be the one person in Cedar Falls who knew that Emma Chin's story was far more complicated than anyone realized. 3 months earlier, Jack had been driving past the Henderson property late one night when he'd seen someone in the rose garden. His first instinct had been to investigate what looked like trespassing, but as he'd drawn closer, he'd realized it was Emma. She'd been kneeling beside one of the rose bushes, her hands moving carefully over the leaves and soil. Instead of confronting her, Jack had watched from his truck. Emma wasn't destroying anything. She was examining the plants with the careful attention of someone who understood gardening. Her fingers traced the stems and leaves with practiced movements, and she'd even pulled out a small notebook to make notes in Braille. When he'd finally approached, Emma had been startled, but not guilty. She'd explained that she was concerned about the health of Henderson's roses. Her grandmother had taught her to identify plant diseases by touch and smell, skills that had proven surprisingly valuable since losing her sight. "There's something wrong with the soil," Emma had told him that night. "The plants feel stressed, and there's an odd chemical smell. I think someone's been using the wrong fertilizer, or maybe there's contamination from somewhere." Jack had been skeptical at first, but Emma's assessment had proven accurate. Within 2 weeks, several of Henderson's prize roses had begun showing signs of disease. The mayor had blamed it on unusual weather patterns and had begun an aggressive treatment program that seemed to stabilize the plants. But now, as Jack walked toward the courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's midnight investigation 3 months ago was somehow connected to the current accusations against her. Inside the courthouse, the preliminary hearing was already underway. Judge Patricia Walsh, a stern woman in her 50s who'd been appointed to the bench just 2 years earlier, was reviewing the charges. Emma sat at the defendant's table with her court-appointed attorney, a young man named David Park who'd graduated law school only 6 months ago and was handling his first major case. The prosecuting attorney was Sarah Mitchell, an ambitious woman who'd moved to Wyoming from Denver with hopes of building a political career. She saw the Emma Chin case as an opportunity to demonstrate her tough-on-crime credentials, especially in a case that had attracted attention from the regional media. "Your Honor," Mitchell was saying as Jack slipped into the back of the courtroom, "the evidence against Miss Chun is substantial and clear. Her fingerprints on the weapon used in the destruction, eyewitness testimony placing her at the scene, and, most importantly, a clear motive stemming from her public confrontation with Mayor Henderson." Judge Walsh nodded gravely. "And how does the defendant plead?" David Park stood nervously. "Not guilty, Your Honor. My client categorically denies these charges and looks forward to proving her innocence at trial." As the hearing continued, Jack studied Emma's face. Even from across the room, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand moved to reassure Rex. This wasn't the posture of someone who had committed a crime. This was someone who was scared and confused, facing accusations that made no sense to her. When Judge Walsh announced that trial would be set for 6 weeks from that date, and that Emma would remain free on her own recognizance, Jack made his decision. He waited outside the courthouse as Emma and her attorney concluded their conversation. David Park looked overwhelmed, clearly out of his depth with a case that was attracting more attention than he'd ever experienced. "Emma," Jack called out as she and Rex began walking toward the street. She turned toward his voice, and Rex guided her in his direction. "Mr. Morrison, what are you doing here?" "I came to see if you needed any help," Jack said simply. "This whole situation doesn't sit right with me." Emma's expression was a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Most people in town think I'm guilty. Why would you want to help me?" Jack was quiet for a moment, watching as other townspeople walked past, some staring openly at their conversation. "Because I've lived in this town my entire life, and I've learned to recognize the difference between someone who's made a mistake and someone who's being railroaded. You fall into the second category." Railroaded. Emma's attorney had approached and overheard the last part of their conversation. "Mr. Morrison, I'm David Park. Are you suggesting there's more to this case than what's been presented?" Jack looked at the young lawyer, then back at Emma. "What I'm suggesting is that maybe it's time someone started asking the right questions instead of just accepting the convenient answers." Over the next hour, the three of them sat in Jack's truck outside the courthouse as he explained what he'd witnessed 3 months earlier. Emma's nighttime visit to the Henderson property, her concerns about the health of the roses, and the subsequent plant disease that had affected the garden. "Why didn't you come forward with this information earlier?" David asked. "Because until now, I didn't see the connection," Jack admitted. "But thinking about it more, I'm wondering if Emma stumbled onto something that night. Something that someone didn't want discovered." Emma had been quiet during most of the conversation, but now she spoke up. "Mr. Morrison, there was something else that night. Something I didn't mention because it seemed unimportant at the time." Both men turned their attention to her. "When I was examining the roses, Rex started acting strange. He kept pulling me toward the back corner of the property, near where it borders the old Hartley place. There was a smell back there, something chemical that didn't belong. But when I tried to investigate, a car drove by, and I got nervous about being caught trespassing, so I left." Jack and David exchanged glances. The old Hartley place had been abandoned for 5 years, ever since old Bill Hartley had died, and left the property to a nephew in California who'd never visited Wyoming. It sat empty except for the occasional squatter or vandal. "Emma," Jack said slowly, "I want you to think carefully. That chemical smell you noticed, can you describe it?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her face concentrated in thought. It was sharp like cleaning supplies, but stronger. And there was something else underneath it, something sweet and rotten at the same time. David looked confused, but Jack's expression had grown serious. "That sounds like it could be chemicals used in illegal drug manufacturing. The old Hartley place would be perfect for something like that. Isolated, abandoned, no one to notice strange smells or activity." The implications of what Jack was suggesting began to dawn on all three of them. If someone was using the abandoned property next to Henderson's rose garden for illegal activities, Emma's investigation that night might have brought her dangerously close to discovering something that could put people in prison for decades. But that still doesn't explain who destroyed the garden or why they want to frame Emma, David pointed out. Jack was quiet for a moment, thinking. Maybe the garden destruction wasn't random vandalism. Maybe it was meant to cover up evidence. If chemicals from the drug operation were contaminating Henderson's soil and affecting his plants, destroying the garden would eliminate any evidence of that contamination. Emma's face had gone pale as she processed what they were discussing. "Are you saying someone destroyed Mayor Henderson's roses to cover up a drug operation? And then frame me for it?" "I'm saying it's a possibility worth investigating," Jack replied. "But if I'm right, then you've stumbled into the middle of something much more dangerous than simple vandalism charges." David Park looked like he was in over his head, which he was. But Jack Morrison had been dealing with complex problems and difficult people for most of his adult life. He'd built a successful ranch, served his community, and earned a reputation as someone who didn't back down from a fight when the cause was just. And right now, protecting an innocent 17-year-old girl from being railroaded for a crime she didn't commit seemed like a very just cause. "Here's what we're going to do," Jack said, his voice taking on the tone of authority that had served him well in business and community affairs. "David, you're going to start building a defense based on reasonable doubt. Focus on the inconsistencies in the evidence and Emma's character witnesses. Emma, you're going to stay out of trouble and let us handle this investigation." "What about you, Mr. Morrison?" Emma asked. Jack's smile was grim but determined. "I'm going to find out what's really happening in this town. And if someone is trying to destroy an innocent girl's life to cover up their crimes, they're going to discover that Jack Morrison isn't someone they want as an enemy." As they prepared to go their separate ways, Emma reached out and touched Jack's arm. "Mr. Morrison, why are you willing to do this? You barely know me, and if you're right about what we're dealing with, this could be dangerous for you too." Jack was quiet for a moment, remembering his own daughter who died in a car accident 15 years ago. She would have been about Emma's age now if she'd lived. "Let's just say I believe in standing up for what's right, regardless of the cost." But as Jack drove back toward his ranch that afternoon, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to discover the cost of standing up for what's right might be higher than he'd anticipated. The investigation he was about to undertake would reveal secrets that certain people in Cedar Falls had killed to protect, and His decision to help Emma Chun would put both of them directly in the path of individuals who had already proven they were willing to destroy lives to protect their interests. What Jack didn't know yet was that Emma's family background held secrets that would completely change everything they thought they understood about her situation. Secrets that, once revealed, would make the current charges against her seem insignificant compared to the dangers she'd unknowingly been facing since the day she'd arrived in Cedar Falls. The morning sun was now high overhead, burning off the early mist and promising another hot Wyoming day. But for Jack Morrison, Emma Chun, and the small town of Cedar Falls, the real heat was just beginning. 3 days after the courthouse hearing, Jack Morrison found himself parked on a dirt road that overlooked the abandoned Hartley property. He'd borrowed a pair of binoculars from his ranch foreman and had been watching the property since before dawn. What he'd seen had convinced him that his suspicions were correct and that Emma Chun was caught in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The activity around the old farmhouse wasn't constant, but it was definitely present. Twice during his surveillance, Jack had watched vehicles approach the property using a back road that wound through a section of state land. The cars never stayed long, 30 minutes at most, but they arrived and departed with the kind of caution that suggested their business wasn't legitimate. More concerning was the discovery he'd made when he'd ventured closer to the property line during the previous night. The chemical smell Emma had described was definitely present, particularly strong near a small outbuilding that sat about 200 yards behind the main house. Jack's years of ranching had given him experience with various chemicals used in veterinary care and equipment maintenance, but this was different. Sharper, more complex, and definitely not something that belonged on an abandoned farm. What had really caught his attention, though, was the evidence of recent activity around the building. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, cigarette butts that couldn't be more than a few days old, and, most tellingly, an industrial-grade ventilation fan that had been recently installed in one of the building's walls. Someone had put significant effort into modifying the structure for a specific purpose. Jack's investigation had also revealed something else troubling. The contamination Emma had detected in Henderson's rose garden wasn't accidental. Someone had deliberately introduced chemicals into the soil, likely as a way to test whether evidence of the illegal operation next door might migrate to neighboring properties. When the test had proven that contamination was indeed occurring, the decision had been made to eliminate the evidence by destroying the garden entirely. Emma had simply been a convenient scapegoat, a teenager with a public grudge against the property owner and no resources to mount an effective defense. But as Jack compiled his findings, he began to realize that the frame job was more sophisticated than it initially appeared. Someone with access to police evidence had planted Emma's fingerprints on the shovel. Someone with knowledge of her daily routines had timed the destruction to coincide with one of her evening walks. Most significantly, someone had been watching Emma closely enough to know about her nighttime investigation of the rose garden 3 months earlier. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a carefully planned operation designed to neutralize a potential witness while providing a convenient solution to the contamination problem. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. He lowered his binoculars and watched as a familiar pickup truck turned onto the dirt road. David Park, Emma's attorney, climbed out and walked toward Jack's position. "Mr. Morrison," David said, slightly out of breath from the climb up the small hill where Jack had positioned himself. "Emma told me I'd find you here. She's worried about you conducting this investigation alone." Jack studied the young lawyer's face. David looked like he hadn't slept much in the past few days, and his usual professional appearance had been replaced by jeans and a work shirt that suggested he was finally taking the case seriously. "What have you learned about the legal side of things?" Jack asked. David settled beside him and accepted the binoculars when Jack offered them. "Quite a bit, actually, and none of it makes the prosecution's case look any stronger." As David surveyed the Hartley property, Jack listened to what the attorney had discovered. The fingerprint evidence was problematic because Emma's prints were the only ones found on the shovel, which made no sense if she had actually used it to destroy the garden. Anyone committing such an extensive act of vandalism would have left additional evidence. footprints in the soft soil, fabric fibers on the greenhouse debris, additional fingerprints on other tools or surfaces. More significantly, the timeline presented by the prosecution had serious flaws. The neighbor who claimed to have seen Emma walking toward the Henderson property had originally told police she wasn't certain of the date. Only after repeated questioning had she become confident that it was the night of the vandalism. "There's something else," David continued, lowering the binoculars. "I've been researching the ownership history of this property, and it gets interesting. The nephew who inherited it from Bill Hartley sold it 6 months ago to a company called Mountain Vista Holdings." Jack's attention sharpened. "I've never heard of that company." "Neither had I, so I did some digging. Mountain Vista Holdings was incorporated in Delaware just 8 months ago. The company has no employees, no business address except for a P.O. box, and no record of any legitimate business activity. It's what's called a shell company, designed to hide the real ownership of assets." "Who's behind it?" "That's where things get really interesting," David replied. "The incorporation documents list a law firm in Denver as the registered agent. When I called them, they claimed attorney-client privilege and refused to discuss their client. But I was able to find out that the same law firm has handled incorporations for several other companies that have been connected to money laundering investigations by the DEA." Jack was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. A shell company with connections to money laundering had purchased the property just months before someone began using it for illegal activities. The timing wasn't coincidental. "David, have you shared any of this with the prosecution?" "I tried to," David said grimly. "Sarah Mitchell basically told me that her job was to prosecute Emma Chun for vandalism, not to investigate unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. She made it clear that if I want to present alternative theories at trial, I'd better have solid evidence to back them up." Jack handed David a manila folder he'd been carrying. "Then, maybe it's time we gave her some solid evidence." Inside the folder were photographs Jack had taken during his surveillance, documentation of the chemical contamination he detected, and, most importantly, copies of property records that showed unusual activity around the Hartley place dating back 6 months. "How did you get property records?" David asked, examining the documents. "I've been on the County Planning Commission for 8 years, Jack replied. "I know which clerks to ask and what questions get answers. What these records show is that someone applied for permits to install electrical upgrades and plumbing modifications at the Hartley property. The permits were pulled under the name Mountain Vista Holdings." David studied the permit applications. "These modifications are exactly what you'd need for a drug manufacturing operation. High-capacity electrical service, specialized ventilation, chemical-resistant plumbing. And here's the really interesting part," Jack continued, pointing to specific dates on the documents. "The permit applications were submitted just 2 weeks after Emma's first visit to examine Henderson's roses. Someone knew she'd been poking around, and they started making preparations to deal with potential discovery." As they discussed the implications of Jack's findings, both men became aware of approaching voices. Jack grabbed his binoculars and focused on the Hartley property. 2 men were walking from the main house toward the outbuilding where Jack suspected the illegal activity was centered. "David, take a look at this," Jack whispered, handing over the binoculars. David adjusted the focus and studied the 2 figures. One was a tall, thin man wearing work clothes and a baseball cap. The other was shorter, heavier, and dressed in what looked like expensive casual wear. "Do you recognize either of them?" Jack asked. David was quiet for a long moment, then lowered the binoculars with a shocked expression. "The shorter man, I think that's Robert Manning. He's a city council member from Casper. I met him at a legal conference 6 months ago." Jack took back the binoculars and studied the man David had identified. Robert Manning was indeed a member of the Casper City Council, but, more relevantly, he was also Mayor Henderson's brother-in-law. If Manning was involved in the illegal operation at the Hartley property, it explained how the contamination of Henderson's roses had been detected and why the decision had been made to destroy the garden. "David, we need to get Emma out of town immediately." "What? What?" Jack lowered the binoculars and looked directly at the young attorney. Because if Manning is involved in this operation and he's connected to Henderson, then Emma has been deliberately targeted from the beginning. They're not just framing her for vandalism. They're setting her up to take the fall for a major drug operation. The full scope of what they were dealing with was beginning to become clear. Emma's investigation of the Rose Garden had accidentally discovered evidence of chemical contamination from the drug lab next door. When Henderson noticed the plant disease Emma had detected, someone had realized that the illegal operation had been compromised. Rather than shut down the operation and relocate, the decision had been made to eliminate the evidence by destroying the garden and framing Emma for the destruction. Her blindness made her an ideal scapegoat because people would assume she couldn't have known what she was doing or seen any additional evidence. But the frame job had been designed to accomplish more than just covering up the vandalism. If Emma was convicted of a felony and sent to prison, she would be effectively silenced as a witness to any other criminal activity she might have discovered. "Mr. Morrison," David said quietly, "if you're right about this, we're not dealing with small-time drug dealers. This is organized crime with connections to local government. They've already proven they're willing to destroy an innocent girl's life to protect their operation. What do you think they'll do when they discover we're investigating them?" Jack had been thinking about exactly that question since he'd started his surveillance. The answer was deeply troubling, but it didn't change his determination to protect Emma and see justice done. "They'll try to stop us," Jack said simply, "which means we need to move faster than they do." Over the next 2 hours, Jack and David developed a plan that was risky, but represented their best chance of exposing the truth before Emma's trial began. Jack would continue his surveillance of the Hartley property while documenting every aspect of the illegal operation he could safely observe. David would use his legal connections to gather information about Mountain Vista Holdings and Robert Manning's potential involvement. Most importantly, they would begin building a media case that would make it difficult for the prosecution to ignore their findings. David knew a reporter at the Wyoming Tribune who specialized in investigative journalism. If they could provide enough evidence to convince her to investigate, the resulting publicity would force law enforcement to take their allegations seriously. But as they prepared to leave their observation point, Jack spotted something that changed everything. A third vehicle had arrived at the Hartley property, and this one belonged to someone both men recognized immediately. Sheriff Tom Bradley climbed out of his patrol car and walked toward the building where Manning and his associate were conducting their business. "Oh no," David breathed. Jack watched through his binoculars as the sheriff was greeted by the other two men like an expected colleague, rather than a law enforcement officer investigating suspicious activity. The three men conversed for several minutes before disappearing into the outbuilding together. The corruption went deeper than they had suspected. The sheriff who was supposed to be investigating the vandalism charges against Emma was actually involved in the criminal operation she had accidentally discovered. "David, Emma is in immediate danger," Jack said, his voice tight with urgency. "If Bradley is involved, then he has access to all the evidence in her case. He knows what we don't know about what she saw that night 3 months ago." They needed to move fast, but they also needed to be smart. Confronting the sheriff directly would accomplish nothing except alerting the criminal organization to their investigation. Going to state or federal authorities would take time they didn't have and require evidence they were still gathering. But Jack Morrison had spent 40 years building relationships throughout Wyoming's ranching and business communities. He knew people in state government, federal agencies, and most importantly, he knew people in media who understood the difference between speculation and legitimate investigation. As they drove back toward town, Jack made a decision that would change the trajectory of Emma's case and expose a level of corruption that reached far beyond Cedar Falls. He was going to make some phone calls that would bring more attention to Emma Chen's case than anyone involved in framing her had ever imagined possible. But first, he needed to make sure Emma was safe. Because once he started making those calls, everyone involved in the criminal operation would know that their carefully constructed frame job was falling apart. And people who had already proven they were willing to destroy lives to protect their interests wouldn't hesitate to escalate to more direct methods of silencing their opposition. The clock was ticking, and Emma Chin's life was about to become far more complicated than even Jack Morrison realized. What none of them knew yet was that Emma's family background contained secrets that would soon make the current criminal conspiracy seem like a minor complication compared to the powerful forces that would soon turn their attention to the small town of Cedar Falls, Wyoming. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Jack and David drove back toward town, both men understanding that they had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. They were now in open conflict with a criminal organization that had connections to law enforcement and local government. But sometimes doing the right thing required taking risks that reasonable people would avoid. And Jack Morrison had built his life on the principle that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Emma Chin's innocence was one of those things. Her safety was another. And Jack was about to discover just how far he was willing to go to protect both. The phone call that changed everything came at 6 in the morning, 2 weeks after Jack Morrison and David Park had discovered Sheriff Bradley's involvement in the criminal conspiracy. Jack was feeding his cattle when his cell phone rang, displaying a number he didn't recognize with a Denver area code. "Mr. Morrison? This is Margaret Chun, Emma's grandmother. I need to speak with you immediately. There are some things about Emma's background that you need to know before her trial begins." Jack had known Margaret Chun for 3 years, ever since she and Emma had arrived in Cedar Falls. She was a quiet, dignified woman who kept to herself and struggled to make ends meet on her Social Security income. Her voice now carried an urgency he'd never heard before. "Of course, Mrs. Chun. What's this about?" "Not over the phone," Margaret replied. "Can you come to the house? And, Mr. Morrison, bring Mr. Park with you. What I need to tell you will change everything about Emma's legal situation." An hour later, Jack and David sat in Margaret Chin's small living room, drinking coffee from delicate china cups that seemed oddly expensive for someone living in poverty. Margaret moved with a grace that Jack was noticing for the first time, and her English, while heavily accented, was more precise than he'd previously observed. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Park," Margaret began, "I need to tell you about Emma's real family, about why we came to Wyoming, and why I've been hiding who we really are." What Margaret revealed over the next hour fundamentally altered everything they thought they knew about Emma Chin's situation. Emma wasn't just any 17-year-old girl who'd lost her parents in a car accident. She was the adopted daughter of Dr. James Chun and Dr. Lisa Chun, two of the most prominent research scientists in agricultural biochemistry. The Chins had been working on revolutionary developments in sustainable farming when they died in what authorities had ruled an accidental crash on a mountain highway outside of Denver. But the accident hadn't been accidental. The Chins had been murdered because their research had threatened a multi-billion-dollar agribusiness cartel that controlled pesticide and fertilizer markets across the western United States. Emma's parents discovered that several major chemical companies were deliberately contaminating agricultural areas to create dependency on their products, Margaret explained. They had documented evidence of soil contamination, water table pollution, and systematic destruction of organic farming operations. Margaret walked to an old desk in the corner of the living room and returned with a thick folder. They were preparing to testify before a congressional committee about these practices when they were killed. Jack and David examined the documents Margaret provided: research reports, chemical analysis data, correspondence with federal agencies, and, most significantly, a list of properties where illegal contamination had been detected. The Hartley property was on that list. "Mrs. Chun," David said carefully, "are you telling us that Emma's parents were investigating the same illegal operation that's been using the abandoned farm next to Henderson's property?" "I'm telling you that the operation you've discovered is part of a much larger criminal enterprise," Margaret replied. "And the people who killed Emma's parents know that she inherited all of their research data." The pieces were finally falling into place. Emma's nighttime investigation of Henderson's roses hadn't been random teenage curiosity. Her knowledge of plant diseases and soil contamination came from growing up in a household where agricultural chemistry was discussed daily. When she detected the chemical contamination in the rose garden, she'd unknowingly discovered evidence of the same criminal activity her parents had been investigating when they were murdered. "Why haven't you gone to federal authorities with this information?" Jack asked. Margaret's expression grew bitter. "Because I don't know which federal authorities can be trusted. The investigation into my son and daughter-in-law's deaths was closed within 3 months with minimal investigation. The congressional hearing they were supposed to testify at was postponed indefinitely. Someone with significant influence made sure their research disappeared and their allegations were discredited. But Emma doesn't know any of this." David asked. "Emma lost her memory of the 6 months before the accident due to her head injury," Margaret explained. "She doesn't remember her parents' research, the threats they were receiving, or the fact that they were planning to relocate the family to Canada for safety reasons. I've kept her ignorant of the truth to protect her." Jack was beginning to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. "Mrs. Chun, you're saying that Emma has been targeted not just because of what she discovered in the rose garden, but because of who she is and what her family knew." "I'm saying that framing Emma for vandalism was just the beginning," Margaret replied. "If she's convicted and sent to prison, it will be much easier to arrange an accident that permanently silences the last member of the Chin family." The room was quiet as all 3 adults contemplated the implications. Emma wasn't just an innocent teenager caught up in a local conspiracy. She was the inheritor of evidence that could expose a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars and bring down individuals with connections to major corporations and government agencies. "Mrs. Chun," David said finally, "why are you telling us this now?" Margaret Chin's composure finally cracked, and tears began running down her cheeks. "Because yesterday I received a phone call from someone who knew details about Emma's case that haven't been made public. He told me that if I wanted to keep my granddaughter alive, I needed to convince her to plead guilty to the vandalism charges and accept a prison sentence." Jack felt a cold anger building in his chest. "They threatened Emma directly? They told me that if she goes to trial, the prosecution will present additional evidence that will result in more serious charges. Drug possession, conspiracy, possibly even terrorism charges related to the destruction of critical agricultural infrastructure." David was making notes as Margaret talked, but Jack could see the young attorney was overwhelmed by the complexity of what they'd learned. "Mrs. Chun," Jack said, "do you still have Emma's parents' research data?" Margaret nodded and walked to another part of the house. She returned with a laptop computer and several external storage drives. "Everything is here." Dr. Chun was very careful to document all of their findings and maintained backup copies of their research. "There's enough evidence on these drives to expose the entire criminal network and prove Emma's innocence." Jack studied the computer equipment. "Why haven't you used this evidence already?" "Because I'm a 70-year-old woman with limited education and no legal training," Margaret replied. "I've been hiding in this small town for 3 years, hoping that no one would connect Emma to her parents' research. But when she accidentally discovered contamination evidence in the rose garden, she made herself a target." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Emma returning from her morning walk with Rex. Margaret quickly gathered the research materials and returned them to their hiding places. "Emma still doesn't know," David asked quietly. "And she cannot know until we're certain we can protect her," Margaret replied. The head injury that caused her memory loss also left her more emotionally fragile than she appears. Learning that her parents were murdered and that she's been living under a false identity could be devastating to her psychological recovery. Emma entered the living room, guided by Rex. She seemed surprised to find Jack and David there so early in the morning. "Mr. Morrison? Mr. Park? Is everything okay? Did something happen with my case?" Jack and David exchanged glances with Margaret, who gave a subtle shake of her head. "We just wanted to update you on some research we've been doing," David said smoothly. "We're building a strong defense based on the inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence." Emma smiled for the first time in days. "Really? You think you can prove I'm innocent?" "We're going to do everything possible to clear your name," Jack promised, meaning every word despite now understanding how much more complicated her situation had become. After Emma left to help a neighbor with grocery shopping, the three adults resumed their conversation with new urgency. "Mrs. Chun, we need to get Emma out of Wyoming immediately," Jack said. "If what you've told us is true, her life is in immediate danger whether she's convicted or acquitted. Where would we go? These people have connections everywhere. They found us once, they'll find us again." David was reviewing his notes from their conversation. "Mrs. Chun, you said Emma's parents were planning to relocate to Canada. Do you know if they had established any connections there?" Margaret nodded slowly. Dr. Chun had colleagues at the University of British Columbia who were working on similar research. They offered to provide sanctuary when the threats began escalating. "Then, that might be our answer," Jack said. "But first, we need to deal with the immediate threat here in Wyoming." Over the next several hours, they developed a plan that was ambitious and risky, but represented their best chance of protecting Emma while exposing the criminal conspiracy that had destroyed her family. Jack would use his research evidence to contact federal authorities who were outside the influence of the local criminal network. David would prepare legal motions that would force the prosecution to respond to their alternative theory of the case. Most importantly, they would use the media connections Jack had developed to ensure that Emma's story received national attention. But Margaret Chun provided the most crucial element of their plan. The research data left by Emma's parents contained not just evidence of the local drug operation, but documentation of similar criminal activities in 12 other states. Federal agencies would have to take their allegations seriously once they realized the scope of the evidence they possessed. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as they prepared to finalize their plans. Emma's parents established a trust fund for her education and future needs. The fund is worth approximately $47 million. Jack and David stared at her in shock. "You've been living in poverty while Emma has access to $47 million. David asked. "The trust fund is in Emma's real name, which I couldn't use without exposing our location to the people who killed her parents. We've been living on my Social Security income to maintain our cover identity." Jack was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "Mrs. Chun, once Emma's real identity becomes public, she'll become an even bigger target. People will assume she has access to that money immediately. But she'll also have resources to protect herself that she doesn't currently possess," Margaret replied. "And more importantly, the trust fund documentation includes records of her parents' research and the threats they received. It provides legal proof of everything I've told you." The plan they finalized was complex and dangerous, but it represented their only realistic chance of protecting Emma and bringing justice for her parents' murders. Jack would immediately contact FBI agents he'd met through his agricultural business connections, providing them with copies of the research data and evidence of the local criminal conspiracy. David would file emergency motions in Emma's case, requesting that all charges be dismissed based on prosecutorial misconduct and evidence of a framed job. Most crucially, they would hold a press conference announcing Emma's real identity and the existence of evidence proving her innocence. Once the story became public, it would be much more difficult for the criminal organization to silence her without attracting federal investigation. But they had to move fast. Emma's trial was scheduled to begin in 8 days, and their investigation had revealed that the prosecution was indeed planning to introduce additional fabricated evidence that would result in serious felony charges. "Mrs. Chun," Jack said as they prepared to leave, "you understand that once we implement this plan, there's no going back. Emma's quiet life in Cedar Falls will be over forever." Margaret Chin looked toward the kitchen, where she could hear Emma humming softly as she prepared lunch. "Mr. Morrison, Emma's quiet life ended the moment she decided to investigate those roses 3 months ago. We can either fight for her survival or watch her be destroyed by people who have already proven they're willing to kill to protect their interests." Jack nodded grimly. "Then we fight." What followed over the next week was a carefully coordinated campaign that would expose one of the largest agricultural crime conspiracies in American history and reveal the true story of Emma Chen's family. But it would also put Emma in more danger than she had ever faced, as powerful people realized that the quiet, blind teenager they tried to frame for vandalism was actually the heir to evidence that could destroy their entire criminal empire. The battle for Emma's life was about to begin in earnest, and Jack Morrison was going to discover that protecting someone you care about sometimes requires risking everything you've worked to build. 3 days before Emma's trial was scheduled to begin, the story broke simultaneously on news networks across the country. Blind teen framed for vandalism was actually target of murder conspiracy. The revelation that Emma Chen was the daughter of murdered research scientists and the inheritor of evidence exposing a massive agricultural crime network sent shockwaves through law enforcement and corporate boardrooms from Wyoming to Washington, D.C. Emma's reaction to learning the truth about her family and her own identity was devastating. The carefully constructed world Margaret had built to protect her granddaughter's fragile psychological state crumbled in a matter of hours. But it also revealed the remarkable strength and intelligence that had been hidden beneath her quiet exterior. I remember, Emma said quietly, sitting in Jack's living room where they'd moved her for protection after the story went public. Not everything, but enough. I remember my parents talking about soil contamination and chemical companies. I remember them being scared. The media attention brought both protection and danger. Federal agents arrived in Cedar Falls within hours of the story breaking. But so did corporate lawyers and private investigators working for the agribusiness cartel that had killed Emma's parents. Sheriff Bradley and Mayor Henderson were arrested on conspiracy charges. Robert Manning disappeared, along with several other individuals connected to the criminal network. The drug operation at the Hartley property was shut down, but investigators found evidence suggesting it was just one small part of a much larger organization. Emma's charges were dismissed, but her legal battles were far from over. The trust fund left by her parents came with conditions that required her to continue their research and advocacy work. At 17, she inherited not just $47 million, but the responsibility of fighting a criminal enterprise that had already murdered her family. Mr. Morrison, Emma said on the day before she and Margaret were scheduled to leave for Canada, I know you were just trying to help someone you thought was an innocent girl accused of vandalism. You couldn't have known what you were getting involved in. Jack was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened since that morning at the courthouse when he'd first decided to help Emma. You know what, Emma? I'd do it again. Some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. Emma smiled through her tears. My parents would have liked you. They believed the same thing. As Jack watched Emma and Margaret drive away toward their new life, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Cedar Falls would never be the same small town it had been before the conspiracy was exposed. But sometimes change was necessary for justice to be served. The rancher who had taken a stand for a handicapped girl accused of a crime had discovered that she wasn't really handicapped by her blindness, wasn't really just any girl, and wasn't really accused of a simple crime. But Emma Chen was definitely worth fighting for, just as Jack Morrison had believed from the very beginning. And sometimes that's all that matters.